Welcome back to Toasty Gaming. Today we're going to take a look at Alkahest, the first attempt to recreate what made Dark Messiah of Might and Magic special. Speed, physics, and environments that reward you for using your surroundings instead of just standing in a spot and button mashing. It's either a disciplined throwback with modern polish, or one of those looks great in a trailer projects. Let's go through what's real, what's staged, and what still needs proving, which is virtually everything. Dark Messiah is still one of the most distinct first-person action RPGs ever made. It has this difficult-to-describe uniqueness of your character having a very high mobility, and you being able to use kicks which have an actual weight behind them, as well as your environment to take care of most enemies, instead of just standing in a spot and hitting the attack button as you would do, for example, in Skyrim or Oblivion. This gives it this unique quality that so far has never been recreated in a game. You win by positioning your timing, staggering enemies into random objects or spikes or a campfire, and turning your environment into your most powerful weapon. The actual fighting was fine, not amazing. The magic and physics were what carried it, and the magic not as much as a tool to directly engage opponents, but as a tool to use the environment and physics to take care of opponents even more creatively. Virtually all studios since then have chased open worlds, cinematic questing, that you see that mountain back there you can climb it type of first-person RPG game design, instead of actually focusing on a strong core gameplay loop. Alkahest positions itself exactly where it should if it wants to succeed Dark Messiah, with a semi-open, handcrafted map, mobility and physics up front, and no attempts at expansive open worlds. Magic gets swapped for alchemy, and if the feel lands, that's most of the work already done. The design idea sounds promising, but the question is whether the people behind this idea can actually turn it into a reality. The developer is Pushon, about 40 people based in Cyprus, Limassol to be exact. The eyebrows go up because there's no major pedigree being waved around, no famous franchise creative lead to market, no from the people who brought you game XYZ. That's unusual for a small team claiming AAA experience. Is this fatal? No. We've watched big-name studios with legends ship mediocrity, just look no further than Starfield, and we've watched smaller outfits create unexpected masterpieces, just look no further than Stardew Valley or KCD. What anonymity does is remove your safety blanket. Nobody to pin the hype on if the game turns out to be trash. On the legitimacy side, the company at least exists on paper. They've been picked up by Hypertrain Digital, a real indie publisher, not someone's weekend LLC, and they seem to have received some form of grant to actually develop that game, and they also have been communicating consistently. That clears the basic "is this vapor" check. At least they exist and aren't some intricate attempt at dodging taxes. Their skills and ability to create a decent game are still unknown. For perspective, scope decides feasibility more than the headcount at the studio, as well as the motivation and capability of the developers that work there. Kingdom Come Deliverance launched from a relatively unknown team and worked because the design had a spine and because it had a unique vision not seen up until this point. Meanwhile, well, we already talked about Starfield as a negative example. It turned out to be nothing. So pedigree is a data point, not a verdict on whether a game is going to be good or bad. Another reason to be optimistic is that Dark Messiah was not some massive game with millions of hours of content. Levels were linear to semi-open with enough verticality, limited verticality, and forks to support different approaches in various rooms. The Spider Temple Island, the catacombs under the temple, this cliff path around the Spider Temple where the Orc village is located, the harbor in Stormhelm where you besiege that ship that will take you to Spider Island. You always moved through comparatively compact spaces that were tuned for your gameplay. You had good sightlines if you wanted to try stealth most of the time. There were some form of railings or ledges which you could push people off. There were braziers or campfires which you could use to set people on fire, maybe some oil flasks you could throw, and always a bunch of barrels and chests to throw around. Lots of opportunities to maybe even send someone into spikes which are randomly placed in the middle of a ship. All of this was basically just small arenas, I'd call them, with a lot of opportunities for environmental combat, but nothing overly expansive. Rebuilding that in 2025 is more of a core systems problem than a map square kilometer problem, and this is actually good news because you can create a very strong core gameplay loop with very few people. What Alkahest needs at the core is movement that reads, brisk acceleration, predictable jump arcs, friction on the movement that doesn't turn into skating or skiing, as well as a functioning stamina system which on the one hand restrains you from just zooming around everywhere, while at the same time also not restricting you too much to actually use the environment and your mobility. It needs a reliable kick or shove, some hit stop, camera impulse, and an enemy stagger knockback distance, which is consistent with, say, someone being kicked down somewhere instead of someone being kicked up somewhere. So you can set up environmental kills on purpose. People often underestimate that most of what made Dark Messiah so good is your ability to zoom around at a comparatively large speed, and being able to kick people back and forth, and thirdly, picking up stuff in the environment and throwing it. For how good Dark Messiah actually was, the core game design behind the gameplay wasn't actually that deep, surprisingly enough. This isn't some rocket science to recreate, ultimately. And what Alkahest will also need are physics that cooperate, because a modern game will have much higher physics expectations. Oil needs to spread logically, fires need to propagate, props have to have believable mass, and ropes and loads needs to behave in a way that is understandable. They actually even already spoke of this when they described how you can attach a rope to a cart to pull the cart, yet when the cart starts rolling downhill for some reason, you will actually be pulled downhill by the cart. This makes me a bit more optimistic as far as the physics system in Alkahest go, because at least the developers seem to understand what they need to focus on when it comes to designing those systems. Finally, what Push-On needs to provide is an environment that actually allows you to utilize your movement and your physics systems to effectively take out enemies using that environment. If all of these core game design aspects are maintained, then Alkahest is going to be a very good game and most likely a worthy successor to Dark Messiah. And all of this is well within a 40 dev capacity if they stay disciplined. You do not need 300 people to ship this. You need a clear core idea of what made the gameplay of Dark Messiah special and so successful, and then you just need a clear hierarchy of priorities during your game design. If you maintain that, you are going to be realistically able to recreate the gameplay loop that made Dark Messiah, well, Dark Messiah. We actually already saw a lot of Dark Messiah-like movement and environmental interactions in the trailers, but a lot of people yelled fake. What I see is the usual staging, enemies placed to line up clean kicks, camera sweeps you won't have during the actual game, overall just camera angles that won't be there during real gameplay, timing that is obviously arranged for a clean sequence of movements. That's virtually all standard practice. The key is whether the underlying animation, staggers, and interactions exist in the game when the player is actually playing, but it seems rather likely as they used in-game assets and therefore also most likely in parts in-game animations. When we look at all of the material we've seen so far, all of the mechanics seem plausible. Even when you compare them to the Dark Messiah gameplay you can see here in the background. Enemy bodies react to the kicks, knockbacks produce space, props collide with the weight, and everything just functions as you would expect, even if it does seem highly staged and controlled. Your playthrough will never look this cinematic, half your setups will be very messy, but if the tools are there, that's fine. Staged is not the same as fabricated. What I find more concerning than the few trailers we've already seen are the informations the developers provide in their press kit. They, for example, list Dark Messiah, Dishonored, and Kingdom Come Deliverance as inspirations in the footage. Dark Messiah here is the obvious backbone, but I've seen not even a little bit of Dishonored or KCD in any of the gameplay. Obviously, there's not going to be any abilities like blink spam or some form of morality system, and how is KCD going to show up? Their entire combat system is centered around this 5-direction fencing plus stabbing, which was then a bit simplified for the second part, but none of that has anything to do with Alkahest's melee, which reads more like light, heavy dodge block, with a clinch space and an emphasis on positioning to create the next environmental kill. That's the right call for this subgenre. Combat as a setup for physics, not as pure sword dueling, but I don't understand why you'd name KCD as an inspiration then, or Dishonored for that matter. Maybe they did this because they like the games themselves, maybe they wanted to broaden their audience, but then I don't understand why you use Dishonored, because Dishonored is basically dead, even though I played at least 1 and 2. No one really cares about the genre anymore. After Death to the Outsider, it basically disappeared, so I wouldn't understand why you would then include Dishonored in your inspirations. I just find this a little weird. It's not the end of the world, I merely can't comprehend why you would name Dishonored and KCD as inspirations when this inspiration can't be seen within any of the footage you've provided so far. Apart from some weird sections on inspiration, we also get some interesting information. For example, that instead of spell schools, Alkahest will center around alchemy, with throwables, weapon oils, potions you drink, and items you plant on NPCs. Two things matter here from my perspective: readability and the option to stack various potion effects. First of all, it sounds very interesting that you can freely mix potions without a recipe and then try to use them as weapon oil or to drink them, which is obviously either going to have good or bad effects for you. But the core things are still readability, so that every effect needs to have a stable color, sound, particle language, so that you know what you're doing instead of just playing roulette. Oil should telegraph what is going to happen, that it's going to slide and ignite most likely. Frost should telegraph that it's brittle footing and reduces your traction. Corrosives should telegraph armor softening and weakening effects. What is also important here is the depth of the alchemy system, which I would just sum up as the ability to stack various alchemic effects. For example, if you throw a potion at someone and then the opponent turns to metal thanks to your potion, you can then throw a corrosive at them that is going to make them rust to pieces and immediately take them out. Things such as this that allow you to actually combine various alchemical concoctions into some interesting ways to use the environment, not just with merely one alchemical effect, but 2 or maybe even 3. But we'll have to see more of the game to be able to judge whether these alchemy systems are going to fit into the attempt to recreate the feel of Dark Messiah. In theory, they could fit this type of gameplay very well, but this is very much centered around how well this is going to be pulled off by the developers. When we are on the topic of alchemy, there's a thematic angle worth calling out. Alkahest, historically, is the universal solvent, a liquid that could dissolve anything, even gold, which had a special status in medieval alchemy. If the game leans into that concept, it could have both alchemy or gameplay implications as well as narrative ones. In the gameplay, you could see it as dissolving constraints in the environment or in your gameplay via alchemy, and from a narrative standpoint, you could read it as dissolving constraints your character is facing in the narrative. We already know that the game is going to take place in a low to mid fantasy kingdom, the Kingdom of Cadanor, which has 3 powerful houses which are in a fragile balance and distrust each other most likely, and you play the younger son of a petty lord. Therefore, we already see that you're probably going to have a bunch of constraints, being the younger child in a noble household, which you might want to, well, dissolve, as Alkahest would suggest in the name. Although that's just pure speculation, I'm just trying to understand why Alkahest was picked as name, because it's clearly not a random choice. It's first of all alchemy related, obviously, and secondly, the choice of the universal solvent probably, hopefully, has some form of implication for the gameplay or narrative. Or maybe it doesn't and it just sounds cool. When we're talking about the story, we already know the kingdom where it's going to be located, which tells us basically nothing, as it's just a made-up kingdom. The starting hook of the game is that there's goblin raids on your holdings border, and that this is your character's chance to finally prove himself being the younger son of this petty lord. This matches with what we've been shown in the gameplay clips so far, well, gameplay trailers so far, where we also seem to see grey goblinoid enemies in both this abandoned castle, and we also see you being ambushed on some road across a more or less forested area. So what I assume based on that is that we are most likely looking at early game footage most of the time, as I think that these grey things are the goblins which are threatening your holdings borders. Furthermore, Push On promises castles, forests, villages, and other realistic settings for the game, which doesn't sound particularly surprising or interesting, honestly, and they also speak of a semi-open world. I interpret this as you having multiple maps you can play on. Maybe you have some form of hub area, considering you are the son of a petty noble house, and then you maybe have some form of map table, and then you can just pick a mission area, and then the mission's going to take place there. I think it's probably going to be pretty close to how it worked in Dark Messiah, just with you being able to maybe pick the location you want to go instead of being funneled through semi-open areas via the linear story. As far as polish goes, the press kit has quite a few typos, which I noticed. For example, instead of feudal, they wrote feodal. I think they didn't write forests correctly, or they didn't show the possessive correctly in English. All of this isn't the end of the world. It's just weird that such typos happen in an official press kit, and that secondly, the press kit isn't sent out as a PDF, but actually provided to you as a Word doc, which you could theoretically manipulate. Like, those are two things which I find a little bit weird. It doesn't have to be the end of the world. It's just important to point out that a developer is making typos and mistakes within a literally 2-page basic information document, which honestly doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in their abilities. So with all of that information, where does that leave us? Well, honestly nowhere, apart from having to wait and see. What we need are about 5 minutes of raw, uncut gameplay with normal field of view and UI, where you fight some goblins from this starting mission to find out what's going on your borders or something, because then we can already judge whether this is going to be an interesting successor for Dark Messiah, or whether this is just some weird trailer, overhyped, honestly trash game. Because the very core things, your movement, how you can use your environment, and how the physics works, can be seen within just 5 minutes. If you can throw around barrels and chairs at your opponents, you can kick them into spikes or off ledges, and if your movement seems to feel interesting and rewarding within that gameplay, then even if this game has a lot of other issues, if this core functions, then this is already going to be an interesting title. If even this core doesn't function, even when anything else would be perfect, the game would still be trash. Once we see a little bit of gameplay, we can pretty quickly decide or tell whether this is going to be a good or a bad game. As a final overview, the red flags we have are that there's no named pedigree at the studio. We basically have no faces we can put to this development. We have the very staged trailers, which risk inflating expectations or just not being as indicative of the gameplay as it might seem. We have those weird claimed inspirations, Dishonored, KCD, which aren't really visible in any of the footage. We have the press kit sloppiness, which might be harmless on paper, but it could be meaningful if it reflects the general, culture at the studio, because this was the English version I read. I didn't read the German press kit or anything. I read the English version of the press kit, which is the most important press kit you're sending out, and having 3, 4, 5 typos there when you probably have a length of 400, 500 words is not a good sign. And finally, we've got the question of how well they're going to be able to implement a lot of, any of the systems, because we just haven't seen enough so far. Green lights, there's honestly not many major green lights, but there are some. The scope has been picked correctly. They have this semi-open, handcrafted spaces approach, which is correct, with a strong focus, based on the few things we know so far, on the physics systems, the movements, and the environment, which is correct. The design thesis works so far, with mobility physics, plus environmental kills, as I just said. The alchemy could be interesting. They've got a real publisher, and it's a real company. I'm really, as you can see, looking for straws here, and there is a clear market gap for a game such as this, so maybe they do actually want to bring back a beloved title. If we're idealists, maybe we can believe that. So that's the red flags and the green flags. Right now, I am very cautiously optimistic, and that cautiously is doing a lot of heavy lifting. The pitch is aligned with what a 40-person team can actually deliver if they stay disciplined and know what they're doing. The main risk isn't the concept, it's tuning and the actual execution. Enemy behavior, how your movement's going to feel, whether your kicks or other ways of attacking enemies have weight, whether the physics works. All of those aspects can be hard to fine-tune, especially for an unexperienced team, and we just know how experienced these people are because we don't know any of these people. One honest uncut slice of gameplay would move this from maybe fake, maybe good to likely good or most likely trash, but so far we just haven't seen anything, so we're just left with guessing. If a raw gameplay slice drops, I'll break it down the same day. Until then, don't pre-order. Well, you can't even pre-order yet because the game's just so far from being finished. Keep your expectations in the lane, and maybe replay Dark Messiah to remember the standard we are measuring against here. Like, subscribe, ring the bell if you want the gameplay breakdown the minute it appears. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and of course, stay toasty. Cheers!